Hi, welcome to an introduction to philosophy in which we engage in some of the ultimate questions that philosophers discuss. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this week we've been looking at the question about what is the mind, and in particular, we've first explored Descartes' discovery of the cogito ergo sum formula, I think therefore I am, if you will, and this cemented the notion of the mind as being the most important element within one's epistemology or theory of knowledge about the world. And so we sort of see with Descartes that the mind functions as something of an Archimedean point epistemologically. We're continuing that discussion on today by looking at the British empiricists. In particular, we're looking at David Hume and John Locke and looking at their understanding of epistemology and their understanding of the self. And all of it's dependent upon this subjective turn that we see initiated in Descartes towards the mind and towards the priority of the mind ultimately. So anyway, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. So this is our lesson again on the self, the British empiricism, and the problem of identity. So what I want to do is I want to start off by making some brief remarks here regarding philosophy after Descartes. And in the last video, we got sort of dense, I think, at the end, I really wanted to emphasize that with Descartes we have something of a rebirth of philosophy. And we can summarize that by talking about the end of scholasticism. Now, scholasticism refers to the movement of education, I guess, or knowledge, the state of knowledge within the medieval world by scholars or the scholarly men. Now, ultimately, what scholasticism was, in effect, was the idea that ancient philosophers, important ancient philosophers, and medieval philosophers would essentially build on the work of those who came before them, hence the emphasis on scholarship. But scholasticism was not all that too interested, if you will, in terms of developing new forms of knowledge or new theories. After Descartes, scholasticism and philosophy effectively begins to die off. And we see two major movements within modern philosophy after Descartes. The first movement here is rationalism. And the main rationalist philosophers, of course, are Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. We're not reading Spinoza or Leibniz, but I just want to sort of throw their names down for you so at least you're aware that these gentlemen are important philosophers. In particular, Leibniz here, he actually invented, independent of Isaac Newton, the form of calculus that we actually teach today in education. So Leibniz was totally brilliant. But we're not going to talk about these guys. I put their pictures here for you. Today we're going to be looking at the British empiricist, and we're going to be looking at John Locke. We're not talking about George Berkeley today. We will be later on. And then today we'll also talk about David Hume, the British empiricist. So we're going to start by looking at Locke, and we're going to see how Locke, number one, rejects Descartes' notion of innate ideas. And I encourage you, if you haven't watched it yet, to watch the other video on Descartes, because what we learn there is that Descartes' argument that there is a world that can be known outside of my body, it was ultimately an argument dependent upon his postulation that we have innate ideas. If we don't have innate ideas, then ultimately Descartes' project fails. And that means that this distinction, the bifurcation between the mind and the world, essentially is made concrete. And that's exactly what ultimately happened with the British empiricist. We'll see that John Locke denies innate ideas, and as a result, he thinks through what the consequences of the denial of rationalism would be. And of course, that is empiricism. And then we'll see David Hume takes it even that much further. Okay? So this is what we're going to be taking a look at today. Now, John Locke, one of the things I love to do when I start talking about John Locke is I love to give you this quote for people to read from his principal philosophical text, an essay concerning human understanding. It's worth mentioning, though, that John Locke's philosophy, John Locke's impact is quite enormous. In fact, most people watching this video are probably familiar with John Locke. Probably less so for his epistemological writings, and more so for his writings on government. He famously wrote two treatises on government. The first treatise that he wrote on government attacks the notion of divine rule and this sort of stuff. The second and more important treatise is the second treatise on government, in which John Locke lays out the principles for republican democracy, ultimately, or a representative form of democracy, or constitutional um, rule within England. Now, he essentially lays out the idea that, now I'm not going to go into all because ultimately Thomas Hobbes is another important figure within the tradition here, but John Locke does lay out the idea that the powers of the president, or the powers of the executive and the legislative branches, should always be separate. And he lays out a theory, essentially a property-centric theory, on why it is ultimately governments exist, and social contract theory. And so, if you're not familiar with it, but if you're interested in it, I do have another video posted online where you can sort of learn about John Locke's second treatise on government, though we're not going to be looking at that today. Today we're looking at his essay concerning human understanding, and where John Locke attempts to evaluate what it means to have understanding. And in the preface, he gives us this brief passage. He writes, "For the understanding, like the eye, judging of objects only by its own sight, cannot but be pleased with what it discovers, having less regret for what has escaped it because it is unknown. Thus, he who has raised himself above the alms basket, and not content to live lazily on the scraps of bigot opinions, sets his own thoughts to work, to find and follow truth, will not miss the hunter's satisfaction, for every moment of his pursuit will reward his pains with some delight, and he will have reason to think his time not ill spent, even when he cannot much boast of any great acquisition." Now, I read that to you because I think it's beautiful, but what does it mean? Well, I want to draw your attention to really this phrase here. "Thus he who has raised himself above the alms basket, and not content to live lazily on the scraps of bigot opinions." I mentioned a little bit ago about the idea that after Descartes, we see the end of scholasticism. And John Locke follows through in that very same tradition, that even though we're going to see that John Locke is not an empiricist, he's not a rationalist, and he disagrees with Descartes, he's fundamentally committed to the Cartesian ethos, which says that we can think and we should think for ourselves. That knowledge can be attained first by the subjective mind, and that knowledge is not a matter of simply agreeing or accepting what someone outside of us believes or tells us to believe. So John Locke is very much in the spirit of his age here, and I wanted to point this out to you because I think this is important, because in particular he's also, notice he's saying raises himself above the alms basket. He's talking about essentially the alms basket within church, within the Anglican Church. And you can see here, he's particularly pointing out the idea that even though we may not end up with lots of acquisition of knowledge, we can at least raise ourselves beyond just accepting what we're taught through our religion, or through any other dogmatic discourse. And so Locke is, I think, very fundamental in this regard. But let's get going. So I always like to sort of start with that, so you get a spirit and you get a sense of the spirit of the man, and what he's talking about. So let me just go through this, and you're going to see here that I'm going to try to be economical with my lecture today, hopefully, and to really hone in on those things that I think are essential if we're to really get a sense of how these philosophers after Descartes, these empiricists, ultimately change the equation in terms of what exactly we think the mind is, and what we think we are in terms of our identity. Now, the first thing to mention is that Locke denies innate ideas. Do innate ideas exist? Are logical truths innate? Well, here's the question. Does everyone know that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts? No. Well, children and mentally impaired persons might not, right? So what the first thing Locke's going to do here is he's going to deny that we have innate ideas, right? Even certain things that we might call logical truths. So for instance, he says mathematical logical truths have to be taught to people. Children don't just know that, for instance, um, certain logical truths like does the whole equal the sum of its parts? People don't know that. They have to learn it, right? And so when we ask the question about what about the innate idea of God that Descartes believed or postulated? Remember, Descartes' idea was that I have this innate conception of an infinite being. I'm finite, so I couldn't have created it. Therefore, the infinite being idea has been caused by an infinite being, hence God. So I have an innate idea that generates my proof that God exists, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that an innate idea? Well, if the idea of God were innate, Locke suggests, then everyone would have the idea of God that Descartes lays out. And yet, quite clearly, and in many societies, people lack this relevant notion or concept of God. Think about it. You can go anywhere in the world, if you start talking about God, in all likelihood, you may mean one thing when you use the word God, and someone from a different religion or culture, or different time, for instance, may mean something else by the very same term God. And so, if God's an innate idea, then how can we have these differences? And also consider children. Children do not naturally know that there's a God that exists. I even took my opportunity to ask at the time, he was, I think, 4. And so I asked him, sort of did my Locke challenge, and I asked him, does God exist? Do you know, does God exist? And my son said no. Now, it's quite likely that he doesn't know what I'm even asking, but that also proves the point for Locke, which is namely that children do not know what God is. Therefore, God must not be an innate idea. Now, interestingly enough, Locke is actually a Christian, and so he wants to defend the idea of God's existence, but knowledge of God's existence is not a priori. It doesn't come before experience. All knowledge of God is a posteriori. It requires experience. So what's the source of our knowledge? Well, he says our knowledge, well, it comes from either sense experience, sensation, or internal reflection. So, and ultimately, though, he has this notion that the mind is a tabula rasa, right? The mind is a blank slate, and experience writes itself on our minds, if you will. So, his view is that there are no innate ideas, which means number one, we have to reject Descartes' meditations after meditation two, right? The cogito still holds, so subjectivity is still certain for Locke, but that means that knowledge is gained through experience. So then the question becomes, well, how exactly does experience author knowledge or these ideas in my mind that I can reflect on? So what we need to do is we need to get clear on Locke's epistemological model and what his model for the mind is. Now, a simple model for his epistemology can be rendered in this sort of sense, where you have an object, there's an object, and then the eye sees the object, and then the mind's eye gets a sense of it. And so here's sort of a picture of what it would look like, right? So here you can see, imagine on your birthday or something, you get a present, right? Now, when you look at the present, right, light waves are literally bouncing off of the present into your eyes, right? So Locke calls this the first movement. And then from your eye, there's another movement where the sense organ somehow transmits whatever it is it receives, these light waves, it somehow transmits that information into the mind's eye, where quite literally, that's where I actually see the present. So keep in mind this, right? So my awareness is always in my head, right? And all of my senses are operating in the same fashion. Now, Locke called this, I'm moving this on accident, right? So Locke called this the idea that there's two motions. Right, there's two motions. This is the first motion, and then this is the second motion. So the two arrows represent the different motions, the first and then the second. Now, here's the question though. My experience of the world is always up here after the second motion with that little present in my head. Because namely, all of my experiences, all of my 5 senses, my sight, my touch, my hearing, my sound, my hearing, my smell, and my taste, these 5 senses all operate the same fundamental way, which is namely, there's a first motion, somehow that motion gets transmitted in a second motion up into my mind's eye, where I have my idea of whatever it is I'm perceiving. But if this is the case for all five of my senses, then that means that everything I experience is always already up here in the little head, in the little present, right? Let's go here. Oh, never mind. Okay, up here. So that means the question then gets raised. How do I know about the world in its objective sense? And the answer is I have no direct access to the world. Or as I put here in this sort of thing, there's no direct access to the table. So when I look at the table, even though I may be even touching the table, my touch, right, is only giving me indirect access to the world, because first the touch goes through my nerve endings, into my arm, through my spinal column, into my brain. My brain works on it, and then suddenly I have this experience of the table. But this experience is here. How do I know that this experience matches my experience of the table on the outside? Or how do I know that the red present here is really red on the outside? The answer is I can never know, right? So that means all of my perceptions are only indirect, as it were. We can't compare our idea of the actual table or the actual present, because any comparison will always already be done through some sort of sensory apparatus. And sensation requires necessarily this indirect relation. So that means that what am I left with? I'm left with this idea that, in a certain sense, all of my it's as if I'm in a chat room where I'm talking to someone on a chat room. Or imagine if you're like me and every once in a while on the weekend you Skype someone who lives far away, right? Well, it's sort of like this, is that all of our experiences are like the Skype experience, right? Because how do I know that what you're saying, because like if I'm talking to you on Skype, right? Or even, yeah, if I'm talking to you on Skype, what I see is a picture of you, but I don't really see you, which means that it's conceivable that something happens in between you saying something and the picture getting generated on my computer screen. In the same sense, that same problem exists for all sensation and for all knowledge gained through sensation. So you can see here, Locke's holding two things. On the one hand, he holds that knowledge comes from experience, but that experience is only indirect. We do not have direct access to the world. And as a result, we're severely curtailed in terms of what we can say we know. Okay? So, what I want to do is continue to develop out this notion that Locke has, where Locke makes a distinction when we talk about perception and our perception of the world and our understanding of whether or not there's objective and subjective properties of the world. He calls these the primary and secondary qualities of objects that we perceive, right? So let me see if I can make sense of this. When we talk, we should make this distinction in when we perceive things, right? Between we perceive objects, but we perceive both primary and secondary qualities in those objects. So for instance, here's my coffee cup. When I look at the coffee cup, I'm perceiving a whole bunch of different things at once, a whole bunch of different ideas, he calls them. Some of them are confused and all over the place, but all at once, I'm perceiving that this thing is solid, that it has a certain sort of shape and figure, right? That there's only so many of these, there's only one of these. I perceive its motion if it's moving, if I spill the coffee, right? I also have secondary qualities. I perceive its color, its taste, and all of these sorts of things. But here's the idea. Which of my perceptions are actually telling me about the object in the world, in the direct sense? Right, where we make this distinction between direct and indirect knowledge. So what do I know in terms of what's really outside of my perception? Well, I know the primary qualities must be somehow real in the world, you would argue. Why? And the primary qualities are things like the extension in space, the solidity, the motion, the number, and the figure. Now, why is it that he wants to say they're primary? Well, they're primary in this regard. If I take away any of the primary qualities I perceive of the cup would cease to be a cup. It would no longer be that thing which I take it to be, right? So suddenly imagine if I'm holding this up and it's not really solid and I could put my hand through the cup. right? Like a ghost or something. If I could do that, that would precisely prove that it's not a cup, right? That's why it's primary. So these perceptions we have, these qualities that we perceive in these objects, things that when they're of this type that if you took them away, it would destroy the object. This is what a primary quality is. And that's why it's solidity, it's extension in space, right? So imagine if I turn this to the side and it just suddenly looked like just a flat piece of paper, you would realize that it's not truly extended in space, and therefore you'd realize it's not a cup. So if it is a cup, its extension must be primary to the object. I hope that makes sense. I feel like it's a little bit contrived sounding, but that's the gist of the ideas. Whereas, by contrast, secondary qualities are subjective. So take a look at this, right? And if your screen is doing it correctly, right, you can say, I could ask you, what color is this little Starbucks symbol on the cup? What color is it? Most of us are going to answer that it's green, right? But wait a second, is it really green? Think about it for a moment. What's really happening when you see the color of something? Well, if you're familiar with light science, you'll know what happens is light waves literally sort of fly in and refract off of this cup, and they fly into my eye. Now, quite literally, what's happening is this color is absorbing all of the colors in this light spectrum, except that frequency that we associate with the color green. And that frequency is getting bounced back out, and that's why I call it green. Wait, so think about it. Quite literally, this cup is actually not green, right? It's green is my reaction to the light waves, right? Green color experience is subjectively determined. That's why, for instance, have you ever asked the question, how do I know that your blue is the same blue that I see? Maybe what we both call blue is really a red experience on my end and a blue experience on your end. But since it's just by name, we all sort of point at it and say, well, it must be blue. How do I know for sure that your experience of blue is the same? The answer is I can never know it. Whereas we can both agree about the solidity of the object, we can't agree about the color. And this goes with these other types of experiences and sensation we have, such as taste, smell, sound, right? Color. So these are subjective properties, or at least they're subjectively determined. And so he calls these secondary qualities, right? So you can see this is a pretty important sort of consequence, ultimately, of the collapse of the Cartesian of the Cartesian's meditations purpose to get us to objective knowledge of the world. Increasingly, we're seeing with the British empiricists that if knowledge begins with experience, then there's actually a whole host of things that we don't actually know, even though we talk as if we do, right? The only knowledge we have of our world are the only objective knowledge we can have of the world are the primary qualities that are deduced from sensation. So the primary qualities are objective, but they're even indirectly known, right? So what are some of the concluding thoughts here? There's three main things I want you to think about with regard to just the very general way I've laid out Locke's epistemology. And to be clear, there's a lot more we should talk about with regarding Locke's epistemology and ultimately the effects of that epistemology on a whole series of ideas. But we're not going to do that today because we really want to just sort of use Locke as a bridge point to think about this problem of identity in Hume. So, but what are some of the concluding thoughts? The first is that matter is unknown to us. Matter is unknown. Now, what is matter? Matter is when I say that this thing I call a cup actually exists in the world, and it exists as a substance of some kind. That's what I mean by the word matter. But the problem is, I never have perception of matter, right? When I look at this cup, I have a perception, I have a felt perception with my touch, I have a visual perception, I have a certain smell perception, I guess I have a certain hearing type of perception, and so forth. But all of these perceptions, all of them are just telling me that this is solid, it feels like has this texture, it has this color. None of these perceptions are telling me for certain that this thing actually has substance. I only have perception of the things I sense. I don't have perception of the substance itself, the matter itself. Because think about it, if you pluck out my eyes, I couldn't see it. If you cut off my ears, I couldn't hear it. If you made it so I couldn't feel anything, I couldn't feel it or taste it and so forth. If you took away all of my senses, the idea of matter or substance just disappears. So this idea that the world is made of matter is really a supposition. And it's a supposition for the idea that, well, what else is causing all of these primary and secondary qualities? It doesn't seem like we are, right? But somehow we are, right? And so ultimately you have to just say, well, we don't know that there's matter. Matter is unknown to us. Now, Locke ultimately believed that even though matter is unknown, that is, it can't be said to be known as a fact, right? We have to presume it anyway because it's the simplest and perhaps the most obvious explanation. But we have to be clear that it's an assumption, not a proof. It's not known, it hasn't been proven, okay? The second sort of major consequence is, well, what exactly is knowledge at all? And Locke argues that knowledge ultimately gets reduced down to the agreement of ideas, right? So normally, because you saw with Descartes, we saw Descartes argue that in order for something to be true, there has to be a correspondence between the statement and the world itself. We refer to it as the correspondence theory of truth, right? So his idea was that a statement is true if it really exists in the world. So something can be known to be true if it really exists in the world. But here, we never have direct access to the world, so that's not possible for us. So that means knowledge cannot be defined in terms of its correspondence to some state of affairs. By contrast, what we'll say is knowledge is when all of our ideas, both those generated through sensation as well as those generated through internal reflection, when all of these ideas are synchronized and they agree with each other, that's what we say knowledge. That's when we say something can be known or is known. And think about it like this. There's serious consequences here for science. Consider that if you go to a physicist class or a chemist class, maybe even some of you are taking physics and chemistry, if you go to one of these classes and you ask your professor, what are we actually studying, right? They're going to tell you, well, we're studying composition, chemical compositions and bonds and this sort of thing. Say, well, what are those? And the chemist is going to sort of scratch their head and be like, well, we're studying what's the world's made of. We're studying matter, right? But you can see here for Locke, that's false. Science doesn't study matter. What does science study? Science studies how we can make our ideas agree. Think about it. Think about it, the empirical observations we make in science, right? So I go through and I run experiments and I have hypotheses and I get these experiments and then suddenly I have these, through sensation, I experience certain sorts of results. It depends on the experiment what those results are, but I experience them and I write them down in my results section because I experienced it, I saw it. Now, what are we doing in science? Ultimately, we're running more and more experiments and we're trying to figure out whether or not our hypotheses agree with overall theories, right? And we're slowly trying to fit all of the ideas together. And this is what Locke thinks is happening in science, ultimately. Science is using an investigative method not to determine matter, but to determine how best our ideas of perception and sensation and reflection can agree together. And this will explain, for instance, why it is that science changes over time. Consider the fact that it's likely that in 1,000 years hence from now, right? If someone's watching this in 1,000 years, maybe they'll agree. I don't know, right? But it's likely that most of the theories that we believe are true today will probably be overturned or revised significantly within the next 1,000 years. Which means what? It means that what we're learning today in science will actually turn out to be what's false in the future. So it's not really knowledge. You can see the only way we can explain the growth and the evolution of science is to postulate something like this. The idea that knowledge is actually the agreement of ideas. It's not about learning about the matter of the world, right? So what does this mean ultimately? If we take something like personal identity, that means that personal identity is functionally dependent on memory. Who it is I think I am, right? When I ask the question, who am I, right? The answer to that question is dependent upon my memory of myself in a series of experience and the agreement of my perceptions of myself. Do I really know who I am? Well, not in an objective sense. I rather know it indirectly. And this is going to become pretty important, especially when we get to our next philosopher, David Hume. And David Hume lived from 1711 to 1776. There he is. And I have a sort of brief bio. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to do that. But I will say a couple remarks regarding David Hume. He was born in 1711 and died in 1776, and he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. So it's sort of insulting to call him a British empiricist, but that's what he's called because he's actually Scottish. Now, he began writing his one of his greatest philosophical works, a treatise on human nature, when he was at the ripe old age of 16 years old. In fact, he wrote most of his work philosophical work when he was quite young. Though he did become famous for his philosophy, really in his own lifetime. He did become very well known in his own life for another work, in particular, his history of of England and his history of the British peoples. That's what he's famously known for. He studied law, but he dropped out to study philosophy on his own. And unfortunately, at the age of 23, he slipped into what we now believe is a severe form of depression. This is why he was actually obese. He, like many people, had the tendency to overeat when he became depressed, and that's what happened to him, unfortunately. And he was constantly struggling with both his weight and his depression throughout his entire life. From 1734 to 37, he actually lived in France, where he wrote his main principal treatises, that is the history. And he never got a job teaching philosophy, but he did become at least for a short time, he became friends with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who even traveled all the way back to Scotland with him. But then they had a falling out, and Rousseau returned to France. But anyway, and then of course he dies of cancer in 1776. That's sort of a brief overview of his biography. But David Hume has been has had an extraordinary impact on modern philosophy, even if his contribution wasn't recognized in his own life. You can see his first work here is a treatise on human nature, and then he eventually broke that larger book into two separate books: an inquiry concerning human understanding and an inquiry concerning the principles of morals. And then he also wrote dialogues concerning natural religion. He was also the first major atheist philosopher in the modern period worth mentioning. He famously wrote his philosophy to, quote, free his countrymen of the myth of Christianity. And to really get a sense of David Hume, keep in mind here that David Hume is living in an age filled with religious violence. And Hume thinks that reason can help provide us a way out of the sort of darkness that England and Europe had been living under in terms of the religious violence that was occurring. So he's a proud atheist and a staunch challenger to anyone of religious faith, because ultimately he sees religious faith as superstition. Now, you'll see that ultimately Hume's philosophy, though, is not itself unhumbled. Hume thinks that he's also sometimes referred to not only as an empiricist, but a mitigated skeptic. That is, he denies much of the things we think we know, he denies. So he denies much of the knowledge that we take as simply obvious, he argues we don't actually have. So what I want to do here is sort of start to flesh out some of his empiricism. And I wanted to begin with this great quote. Since I had a quote from Locke, I figure I should have one from Hume, in which Locke says this: indulge your passion for science, says he, but let your science be human and such as may have a direct reference to action in society. Abstruse thought and profound research as I prohibit, and will severely punish, by the pensive melancholy which they introduce, by the endless uncertainty in which they involve you, and by the cold reception which your pretended discoveries shall meet with when communicated. Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man, right? So, or be still a woman, I think maybe we could translate today. And what's his argument there? Again, he's arguing that we should be able to think for ourselves, right? But he's warning us against really abstruse thought. He thinks we need to begin to ground our understanding of what we think is reasonable. And that's exactly what he's going to do in this philosophy. So let's sort of move through. And you can see here that what I want to do in these next couple slides here is really take you through some of the fundamental elements of Hume's epistemology here. Now, of course, just in my usual caveat, there's a lot more to talk about here than just this. So keep in mind, this is a simplification of Hume's position, and I encourage you to read Hume in his full writings. Okay. So anyway, the first thing I want to mention here is that when we talk about knowledge, first off, he's an empiricist, so knowledge comes from experience, okay? But when we talk about knowledge, we can say that knowledge can be divided into two separate categories. The first are impressions, and the impressions, those are our sense experiences. Now, I sort of talked about perception when I talked about John Locke, but to be clear, John Locke's philosophy, he only uses the word ideas throughout his entire book, and sensation. So he just talks about sensation ideas. But Hume's saying, listen, let's clarify a little bit. There are some things we call ideas, and there are other things that we should call impressions. The impressions refer to our sense experience of these things. Now, impressions can be divided into two subcategories: simple impressions on the one hand and complex impressions on the other. Imagine, for instance, if you look at the white cup or you look behind me at the white wall. A simple impression would be your impression of just the whiteness or the color that you're seeing. And a complex impression is when I combine many simple impressions into one fuller impression, namely the fuller object. So for instance, if you look at this coffee cup, right, here, look in this way, you can see that there's white here, there's black writing over here, there's brown, and there's different colors and shades and this sort of thing. What's happening is your mind is receiving multiple simple impressions and combining them into one more fuller complex impression. Okay? Now, so the first category of knowledge is the category of impressions. The second category of knowledge is our ideas. Now, our ideas are generated from our impressions. So I have a simple impression of the white, and then eventually I build up a simple idea, like the cup. The cup becomes a simple idea. But I also have complex ideas, so I can build my concepts in, like, I can have the notion of a styrofoam cup. So there I have a simple idea of styrofoam and even in a simple idea of cup, and I've combined them together into a complex idea. So we have both simple impressions, complex impressions, but also simple ideas and complex ideas. Now, but here's the critical principle that all of it is important. Any knowledge that's not based on a simple impression is meaningless, right? Because if knowledge comes from experience, then that means that knowledge starts here and works its way down. In fact, if you wanted, you can imagine we could add a little arrow here, right? Knowledge begins this way and works its way down, right? So we begin with simple impressions, and then we move down slowly. But anything that's truly said to be known must originate in sensation, right? It must originate with this sensation of some sort of simple impression. So that means what? All ideas in terms of knowledge, in fact, well, actually, all ideas, period, are always a posteriori. They're post-experience, past experience, or after experience, rather. They're not a priori. So there's no innate ideas either. Of course, he agrees intimately with Locke's disagreement regarding innate ideas as well. So this is the first thing, impressions versus ideas, and that principle is critical. So let's move here next thing. We can also make a further distinction between kinds of statements. So there's two kinds of statements, two kinds of statements, I'm sorry. The first kind of statement is what we would call a relation of idea, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, relations of ideas are when we make statements where we take our ideas and then we relate them together in a certain way. Now, these ideas provide us with absolute certainty, like in mathematics, so such that we know that there's only one way to relate these ideas together, right? But the problem is that relations of ideas do not give us knowledge about the world, right? Relations of ideas only tell us about how ideas relate, right? Information about the extra world must be based on sense impressions. So there's a second type of statement. These are matters of fact. So imagine if I say the time is 1:06 p.m. Now, these are statements about the world which provide us with absolutely no certainty. And when I say no absolute certainty, what I mean is these are statements that are contingent. They didn't have to be that way. So I'm absolutely sure that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm not absolutely sure that this time is 1:06 because it could be 1:07 actually, right? But matters of fact, even though they don't have certainty, they do actually tell me about the world, right? So matters of fact link me to the world, but relations of ideas, they have certainty, but they're severed from the world. And when I talk about absolute certainty, I mean certainty where where they avoid meaningful contradiction. So for instance, this is sort of an odd example, but imagine if I say there's not a dog on this table, right? If I say there's not a dog on this table, that's contingent, meaning there could be a dog on the table. So when I say there's not a dog on the table, I can be sure of it, but that's not to say that I'm absolutely certain of it, because it's possible, it's contingently possible. Whereas if I say the triangle has 4 sides, that is always false, no matter what, right? Because that's a relation of idea. But the fact that I can make an affirmative judgment that there's no such thing as a triangle with 4 sides does not in itself, despite its certainty, does not give me knowledge about the world. So you can see Hume is severing this idea that we have ideas about the world and that we actually have knowledge about the world, and they work very distinctly. They work in opposition, I suppose you might say. Okay, so there's these two kinds of statements. Now the next thing worth mentioning is there's what Hume calls 3 laws for the association of ideas. Now, Hume recognizes that when we have knowledge, our knowledge consists of a whole series of ideas that are organized in a certain way. So the question becomes, how do we organize them? How do we associate specific ideas with other ideas that we think are important? Hume thinks there's 3 ways we do it. The first is the law of resemblance. That is, the ideas can resemble each other. So consider the fact that when you see a picture, the picture easily leads us to thoughts of the original, right? So for instance, when we looked at this picture of David Hume, right, all you're actually seeing here, if you're watching this on a computer screen or some other sort of screen, is you're seeing pixels. Some of them are red, some of them are yellow, some of them are black, that are just organized in a certain way. And they're organized in such a way that they resemble that of a man. And in this case, it's the man David Hume. So you have the law of resemblance, right? And so this is one way our ideas relate. The second way is the law of contiguity. And contiguity is just a fancy way of saying next to or near. And I want you to think in terms of space and time, or the things being spatially near or temporally near each other. So thinking about my house naturally leads me to think about my neighbors. So for instance, imagine that if you're walking with me, it's Halloween, and we're both trick-or-treating as we walk down the street. And you ask me, you say, which house is yours? And I say, oh, well, see that house? Mine is just on the other corner from that one, right? It's, just on the other corner, around the corner from where that one is. You would now know where my house is, so you'd have an idea of my house, and now you've associated with your perception of the house I pointed out, right? So you can see that we also relate our ideas in terms of their spatial arrangement or their sequential arrangement. Time, for instance, if I said, I'll see you the week after next, right? There I'm associating my ideas according to contiguity, right? Finally, there's the law of cause and effect. And remember, the law of cause and effect here is one of the ways we associate our ideas. That is, we think that some ideas have a necessary a relation on others such that they cause those ideas. So, for instance, you can imagine that, um, well, basically, science associates ideas in this fashion, right? So I have the notion that, um, let's say I get in a car accident, I back up, boom, and I hit someone's car, and then their car is dented in. I think I relate the idea that my backing up and then feeling that jolt is actually caused this other idea, which is namely the bent in fender or whatever, right? So you can see here we relate our ideas in terms of their causal relationship or causality, cause and effect, right? Now, but here's the important thing we're going to see is that even though Hume argues that we relate our ideas and associate them through either resemblance, contiguity, or causality, that cause and effect is not in itself something in the world. And this will make sense here in just a minute, okay? So hopefully we've laid it out. It's just a quick review here, right? So you got impressions and ideas. Knowledge must come from a simple impression. You've got relations of ideas and matters of fact, right? So reports about the world that are not certain, that is, they're contingent, but they tell you about the world. You've got math and logic that tells you stuff with certainty, but it's not about the world. And then, of course, you've got these three laws for the association of ideas. And when you put them all together with this key epistemological principle, you end up with some really revolutionary ideas. And again, that principle is certain and philosophical knowledge must begin with a simple impression. Must begin with a simple impression. So let's start with this. Let's start with the first consequence, and there's many different consequences, and I'm giving it to you really quick and brief here, so I know it's sort of like drinking from a fire hose, so I appreciate your patience. But the first is cause and effect, right? What about real cause and effect? Now, everything matters here when we're talking about cause and effect. I mean, science depends upon the concept of cause and effect. I wrote here, science assumes cause and effect relations exist in the world. And when I say that science assumes they exist in the world, scientists assume that cause and effect relationships exist in the sense that they exist in the world outside of myself, outside of my perceptions. And this is fundamental because if cause and effect, and by cause, what do we mean? We mean a necessary connection between events, right? Such that if you mix two different compounds together, it creates an explosion. We want to say that's a necessary relationship in terms of there being one effect versus another effect. And science assumes this because you can't run experiments if you don't assume there's a necessary connection between events. What else would be able to verify the replicability of said experiments? So the question though is, if science depends upon causation, our question is there a simple impression for causation, for causality? Because remember, our epistemological principle is that all of knowledge must be traced back to a simple impression. So let's do sort of an experiment here. I want to show you now. Hume was a billiard ball player and he loved playing pool. So I want to show you an example of a cause and effect relationship. Okay, and here is just a billiard ball being hit. So let's start it. Okay. These are slow motion captured images. So just take a look. We've got a ball hitting the side of the pool table, flying back and forth. Let me see if I can scoot ahead here. You can see these are causal relations. Let me go back. This was supposed to zoom in a little bit further. Here we go. Watch this. Okay, so you're having an experience of a causal event right now. The first thing you've seen is this pool cue hit the ball. The ball's moving, the yellow ball, and then the yellow ball hits the white ball and moves it. I think let's watch that just one more time and see what that looked like, right? Just because this is important, because all of us would agree that the white ball on your screen moves as a causal effect of the pool cue hitting the yellow ball, okay? So let's just watch it one more time. There it is. The yellow ball is hitting. There you go. Boom. The yellow ball hit the other white ball, and now they're all in motion, right? Sorry about that. Something I accidentally got hit, right? So you can see here, so that because of this, we would all say that what we have here is a causal event, right? After all, when you bet money on a pool game, you're betting the money based on the idea that another person really can put the ball in the hole, meaning, or you can put the ball in the hole. And the idea there is that there's a necessary connection between what one player does and the effect of the balls that that player has. So we assume cause and effect. So here's the question. Did you see a simple impression of cause and effect? Right? Let's watch it again. You have a simple impression of the cue ball, you have a simple impression of the yellow ball, and you have a simple impression of the motion of the white ball. But where, my friends, is your simple impression of the causal relation itself, right? And Hume says we could atomize our experience, right? We can slow it down. And imagine, let's just take it frame by frame. Let's see, let's move it here. There's the first frame, and then you see that frame, the ball's moving, and then you see the other ball. Let's see if we can find it. I don't know if I can get to where it hits the other ball. Right there, it's about to hit it. Boom! Somewhere in there was the causal relationship. But did you see it? Did you have a simple impression in your eyes of the causal relation, the necessary connection between event A and event B? The event A is the yellow ball hitting the white ball. Do you have a simple impression? The answer is no, you don't. There's no simple impression of cause and effect relationships. There's no simple impression of causality. Let me give you another example. Imagine if I go back here and I flip the light on. Why is it that when the light turns on by me flipping a little switch, why is it that you think I caused the light to turn on and off? Did you see me cause it? No, you saw me flip the light and then you saw a light turn on. Imagine, for instance, couldn't it be another way? Couldn't it be possible that, for instance, I have a remote in my pocket and that actually I've dismantled the switch and it's not wired, but then when I flip it, I press the button in my pocket and it turns on the light? You would have a false impression about what's causing what. What that reveals is that you have no simple impression of causal relations. You only have impressions of the events, which means you have matters of fact, right? You're learning something about the world, but not learning about causality in the world, right? And what you are learning doesn't have any absolute certainty. Certainly not the absolute certainty we're after in science when we talk about cause and effect. Now think about what are the devastating consequences here. It means that the things we experience as causal relations are actually a constant conjunction of events. It's just through repetition that I see cue balls hitting them over and over and over again. I've seen so many people flip the light switches that I come to believe that when you do that, it causes the lights to turn on. But I don't actually see the cause and effect. So that means I can't talk as if I know there's cause and effect. I can only talk about the idea that I experienced what appears to be a constant conjunction of perceptions. But what's behind those perceptions, the necessary connection between them, is unknown. And what does that mean for science? It means that science is effectively in no better shape than rain dancing. Remember, what do rain dancers do? In the ancient world, and even still in some, tribal places, when there is a drought, a severe drought, you call in a rain dancer, they make some prayers, they dance, and then it rains. Now, why did people in the ancient world believe that rain dancing could actually cause the rain to fall? The answer is because they'd seen it so many times. And they'd seen it probably because the people who come to the rain dancing watched the weather. And so what developed was a constant conjunction of events, but then we assume that's causality. And then we have a whole series of we believe a whole series of false things that we cannot actually know. So that means science, in terms of any science that needs or assumes cause and effect, is unfounded. So that's one consequence. But what about the consequence of identity? Now, let's think about it. What is my identity? I use the letter I, right? When I write my name, I say, I am Mark Thorsby. What does the word I stand for? What is the I in my identity? And let's think about it for a moment. Remember, to say that we know something means we have to be able to point to a simple impression for that thing. I want to think that I have a self, I have a personal identity, right? And that's what the word I stands for. But do I know it? Do I have a simple impression for my identity? Well, wait a second. What kind of impressions do I have? Well, imagine this woman here. What's her identity? She has simple impressions, and people have had simple impressions of her, or complex impressions. For instance, when she was a baby, there was a little person they called her, who they gave that name to, little baby. And as a child, she had perceptions. All right. She had perception, for instance, of maybe growing up, getting married, things like this, of getting a career and this sort of things. And you can imagine we could take every perception that this woman's ever had, right, simple and complex, and put them all on the board, and all of them are pointing to the same sort of thing. The question is, but wait a second, if my identity is actually based on a bundle of perceptions, right, then I have simple impression of the perceptions, but I do not have a simple impression of the perceiver. There's no simple impression of identity, right? Think about it. You perceive the world every day. You wake up and you think you're the same person. You go about your life and you're perceiving all of this stuff. But at any point, have you perceived yourself? Now, certainly you've looked in the mirror, but that's a perception of the mirror. Have you had a perception of yourself in the sense of the subjective cogito? The answer is no, you haven't. There is no simple impression. And if there's no simple impression for identity, then that leads us to the consequence for Hume that the word I is what Hume calls a grammatical fiction. Because after all, how do I not know there could be multiple versions of me, right? Maybe each day, imagine, this is a crazy thought experiment, but imagine that you could imagine that maybe there's a God and God created the world and that God let the world run, but that every day, at the end of each day, God destroys the world and then waits 1,000 years and then recreates the world identically, right? And then we live a day, we have all of our perceptions, and then we're all destroyed, and then God recreates it, right, from where we were before, and then, right, what if that was the case? That would mean that who I am is really a series of a whole bunch of different people. Now, no one is seriously suggesting that that is actually the case. But what we are suggesting, what Hume is asking you to consider, is the idea that this thing that you think you are, this identity that you're willing to fight for, and in some cases even kill for, is ultimately fiction. It's something you've created to make sense of your experience, but it's not something you can say you know. So we should stop talking as if we have a single identity, because there's nothing to identify the identity with. Interesting, fascinating results, because it ultimately means that you can see here that the British empiricists are propelling us through this sort of, I like this, of a sort of jet engine, a grinder of ideas. Out the back end, we come out and we sort of end up with these big questions. Well, wait a second. It looks like knowledge is increasingly based upon my subjective experience, but I don't even know what a subject is because I don't know what I am. So there's real issues at stake here. And you can see here, hopefully, that how Descartes, in our previous lecture, sort of begins the discussion by really establishing subjectivity as the beginning point for knowledge. And we can see here that the end result is ultimately that whatever it is that I am, this thinking thing that I am, this mind, I don't really know what it is, let alone even that there's cause and effect relationships in the world. I'm in a state of skepticism. And perhaps this is why Hume was often driven to despair himself, philosophical despair. Because it looks like most of what I live in terms of my beliefs, most of the things I believe are actually, well, they're assumptions. the presumptions, that I'm actually in very much in a state of ignorance. Okay, that's our video for today. So as you ask this question, what is the mind? Consider these ideas. Thank you guys very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys online on our next video. Okay, bye.